Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And that's where our story begins. A contract marriage. But could it turn into something more? The next morning, Mark sat at the kitchen table with his mother, trying to process the events that had unfolded the previous night. His fingers nervously tapped against the coffee mug in front of him, his mind racing. The decision he had to make weighed heavily on him, but there was no easy answer. His mother, with her tired eyes and soft, fragile voice, had been through so much. The thought of losing their home, of not being able to provide for her medical treatments, was too much to bear. He knew he was cornered, and Eleanor's offer was the only way out. His mother looked at him, her gaze filled with concern but also with a quiet desperation. "Mark," she began softly, "I know this isn't what we hoped for. But if this woman is offering you a way out, you have to think about what's best for us. For me, for our future." Mark swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his throat. "I never thought it would come to this," he whispered, running his hand through his wet hair. "Marrying a stranger for money. It's not what I want, but what else can I do?" His mother reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "Sometimes we have to make hard choices," she said. "This could be the only way we get out of this mess." Mark nodded, but the weight of his decision still hung over him. Later that afternoon, he found himself walking back to Brooks' Bistro. The rain had stopped, but the gray sky still hung heavy overhead as he made his way through the damp streets. The thought of marrying Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, for financial stability, seemed surreal. But what choice did he really have? His family's survival was on the line, and he could no longer afford to be idealistic. As he entered the bistro, Eleanor was already seated at the same table, her posture immaculate, her eyes sharp and calculating. She didn't look up as Mark approached, but when he cleared his throat, she finally glanced up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "You've made up your mind, I see," she said, her voice smooth and confident. Mark took a seat across from her, his stomach churning with nerves. "Yes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." Eleanor's smile widened, though it was not the kind of smile that conveyed warmth. "Good," she said simply, as if it were nothing more than a transaction. "We'll need to make the arrangements quickly." She handed him a legal document, thick with pages and filled with terms and conditions that Mark barely understood. "You'll need to sign this, and we can proceed." Mark glanced at the contract, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the pen. He didn't have time to fully digest what he was agreeing to. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about his mother, about the debt, about the future. He signed the paper with a quick motion, barely pausing before putting down his pen. As soon as he signed, Eleanor picked up the contract and smiled. "We'll be married tomorrow," she said, her tone final, as if the matter had already been settled. "We can't waste time. There's a lot to be done." Mark felt a sense of finality settle over him, a feeling that this decision, though it might have been born from desperation, was now irreversible. He had sealed his fate, and in doing so, had signed away any hopes of a normal future. That night, Mark lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. What had he just done? He had agreed to marry a woman he didn't love for money, for survival. But what was the cost of such a decision? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no other choice. He needed the money. He needed the security. He couldn't afford to be a dreamer anymore. The next day, Mark arrived at the courthouse, his heart heavy with dread. He stood in front of the judge, his hand trembling as he repeated the vows Eleanor had carefully prepared. "I do," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. Eleanor stood beside him, her face cold and emotionless, as if this whole affair was nothing more than business. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Mark's stomach dropped. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. He had done it. He was now married to Eleanor Brooks. And as they walked out of the courthouse together, he couldn't help but wonder what his life would be like now. What had he just signed up for? As Eleanor led him to her car, he glanced around, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. The reality of what he had just done was starting to sink in. He was married to a woman he didn't know, to a woman he didn't love. And the worst part was, he didn't even know if she cared about him, or if this was just another business deal to her. But as he climbed into the car, he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change, and there was no turning back now. The following morning, Mark sat in the lavish living room of Eleanor's estate, feeling like a stranger in a foreign land. The house was magnificent, filled with expensive furniture, towering windows, and decorations that exuded wealth and elegance. But despite the opulence surrounding him, Mark felt a deep emptiness. He was sitting in a home that wasn't his, living a life that wasn't his, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a world that was far beyond his reach. Eleanor had given him a tour of the estate the night before, showing him his new home, as if it were just another business deal. He had been introduced to staff members who barely acknowledged his presence, and he had been shown to a guest bedroom, cold, sterile, and devoid of any personal touch. It was as though he was just another item on Eleanor's checklist, another piece of the puzzle she was trying to complete. Mark sat there, running his fingers along the edge of his coffee cup, lost in thought. He had no idea what to expect from this arrangement. All he knew was that he had signed away his freedom for the sake of his family. He had no connection to Eleanor, no emotional bond. He was a stranger to her, and she was a stranger to him. But he couldn't help but feel that there was more to this than he realized. As he sat in silence, Eleanor entered the room, dressed impeccably as always. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you settling in?" she asked, her tone neutral, though there was an edge to her voice. Mark looked up at her, his stomach twisting. "It's fine," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's just different." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "It should be," she said. "This is your new life now. Get used to it." Her words stung, but Mark didn't say anything. What could he say? He had no choice but to get used to it. Later that day, Eleanor took Mark to an event at one of her company's charity galas. The event was held at a luxurious venue with marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and an air of exclusivity that made Mark feel completely out of place. He had been instructed to wear a tuxedo, and as he looked at his reflection in the mirror before leaving, he barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him was no longer the college student struggling to make ends meet. He was a man who had just signed away his identity for a life of wealth and luxury, all for the sake of survival. As they arrived at the gala, Mark could feel the eyes of the other guests on him. They were all dressed in their finest, speaking in hushed tones, and exchanging pleasantries like old friends. Mark, on the other hand, felt like an imposter. He didn't belong here, and he wasn't sure how he was supposed to act. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved through the crowd with ease. She was the center of attention, commanding the room with every word she spoke. As they mingled, she introduced Mark to several of her business associates, all of whom greeted him with a polite smile, but little more. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were all just waiting for him to leave so they could get back to their lives. The evening wore on, and Mark found himself alone at a table, nursing a glass of wine. He watched as Eleanor worked the room, her cold demeanor never faltering. There was a part of him that resented her for treating this whole arrangement like business. He was just a pawn in her game, a means to an end. But another part of him couldn't help but feel curious. There was more to her than met the eye. Eleanor had made it clear that this marriage was a business deal, but the more Mark observed her, the more he realized that she was hiding something. There was a vulnerability beneath the surface, something that she kept hidden behind her sharp exterior. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew there was more to her than just a businesswoman. And as much as he hated the idea, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her. As the night came to a close, Eleanor approached Mark with a smile. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked, her voice softening slightly. Mark hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's fine." He didn't want to admit that he was feeling uncomfortable, but he didn't know how else to respond. Eleanor nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. "Good. Let's go home." Mark followed her out of the venue, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had just spent hours pretending to be something he wasn't, surrounded by people who didn't care about him. But as he stepped into the car beside Eleanor, he realized that this was his new reality. The life he had known was gone, replaced by a world of wealth and power that he couldn't quite understand. As the car drove through the city, Mark looked out the window, lost in thought. He had made a deal with Eleanor, but what did that deal really mean? Was he truly trapped in a marriage for convenience? Or was there something more to this relationship than he realized? As he glanced over at Eleanor, sitting silently beside him, he knew one thing for sure. His life was never going to be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark had found himself slipping deeper into the routine of his new life. Eleanor, though cold and distant, made sure he was well taken care of. The house was large, and every room seemed to carry the weight of its wealth and history. But despite the luxury surrounding him, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He had been thrust into a world that felt so far removed from everything he knew. Every time he passed the staff or interacted with Eleanor's business associates, he was reminded that he was still just the man who had signed a contract out of desperation, and that made him feel small. The nights were the hardest. He lay awake in the large, empty bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Was this what his life had become? A transaction? A series of events that led him here, into this gilded cage? He couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward Eleanor, though. As much as he hated it, there was something about her that intrigued him, something beyond the cold businesswoman persona she wore so well. One morning, Eleanor called Mark into her study. He had grown accustomed to these brief encounters, where she would lay out new expectations for him or give him updates about their arrangement. He wasn't sure why she even bothered with him. It felt like she was only interested in him as a means to an end. But something in her voice this time was different. It wasn't her usual businesslike tone. There was something softer, almost uncertain. As he entered the room, Eleanor was sitting at her desk, going over papers. She didn't look up when he walked in, but there was a slight pause in her movements. "Mark," she began, her voice measured but with an underlying tone of something Mark couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." He stood by the door, unsure of how to respond. "About what?" he asked, his voice flat. Eleanor looked up then, her eyes locking with his. For the first time since they had met, Mark saw a flicker of something in her expression. It was brief, but it was there. Something real. "About us," she said softly. "About what this is." Mark furrowed his brow, trying to understand what she was saying. "I thought we made that clear," he said, his voice cold. "This is a business arrangement." Eleanor sighed, leaning back in her chair, and for a moment, she seemed almost tired. "It is," she said, her voice a little quieter. "But it's not that simple, is it? We've been pretending, haven't we? Pretending that this isn't a real marriage. Pretending that this is just business." Mark was taken aback by her words. He had expected her to brush this off, to remind him of the deal they had made. But instead, she was acknowledging something he had been too afraid to confront. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want this. But I had no choice. I needed the money. I needed to survive. And now here we are." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to crumble just a little. "I get it," she said, her voice almost gentle. "But what happens when the pretending stops? What happens when we can no longer keep up the act?" Mark swallowed, his throat tight. He hadn't expected her to talk about this, to acknowledge the strain that had been building between them. But now that she had, he wasn't sure what to do with it. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to. "I don't know," he replied quietly. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and then she stood up from her desk. She walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. When she reached him, she stopped and looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what this is either," she said softly. "But I think we need to figure it out." Mark could feel the tension between them, the unspoken emotions that neither of them wanted to address. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was just a pawn in her game. He wasn't sure what this meant for their arrangement, for their marriage, but there was a sense of something shifting in the air. Something that made him feel, for the first time since he had walked into her world, like he might actually have a place in it. Later that evening, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner. It was a quiet, intimate affair, the two of them sitting at a small table in one of the many rooms of the mansion. The atmosphere was different from the gala, from all the public events they had attended together. It was just the two of them, no business associates, no distractions. Eleanor seemed almost human in this setting, her sharp edges softened by the warmth of the moment. As they ate, they talked, really talked, about things other than business. Mark found himself laughing at her dry sense of humor, and she seemed to relax for the first time. It was strange, this new dynamic between them. But as the night wore on, Mark realized that he didn't mind it. It felt natural. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, he forgot that they were bound by a contract, by a deal. It felt like they were just two people, trying to make sense of the chaos that life had thrown at them. The evening ended quietly, with Eleanor walking Mark to the door. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle over him. Things were changing between them, but he wasn't sure if it was for better or for worse. He had spent so long convincing himself that this was just a business deal, that he couldn't let himself feel anything else. But now, with the tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air, Mark wasn't so sure anymore. As he walked back to his room, Mark glanced at the door to Eleanor's study, where he had just been. He had agreed to this marriage out of necessity, but now, he was beginning to wonder, was there more to it than he had realized? The next few days brought a strange sense of tension between Mark and Eleanor. They continued to play the parts of a married couple, but there was something unspoken between them now. Eleanor was still cold and businesslike in her interactions with him, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where Mark could almost see a different side of her. They shared occasional conversations that felt more genuine than anything they had exchanged before. They laughed over small things, shared quiet dinners, and for a brief moment, Mark found himself wondering if he had misjudged her. But those moments were always followed by the harsh reminder that they were still bound by a contract, by a deal neither of them had truly wanted but both had agreed to out of necessity. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Eleanor asked Mark to accompany her to one of her charity foundation's projects. Mark had been to many of these events, but this one was different. It wasn't a lavish gala or an exclusive affair. It was a visit to a local community center, a humble building that looked out of place compared to the luxurious estate Eleanor called home. As they stepped inside, Mark was surprised by the warmth of the place. Children were running around, playing, and adults were busy volunteering, handing out supplies, and preparing meals. Eleanor, for the first time in their entire arrangement, seemed relaxed. She spoke to the volunteers like she genuinely cared, asking about the kids, inquiring how she could help. Mark watched her, his mind racing. This side of Eleanor was so different from the calculating, business-minded woman he had met. For the first time, he saw her as someone who was more than just a powerful CEO. He saw a woman who cared about something other than money and status. It was a side of her he hadn't expected, and it made him question everything about their marriage. After the visit, they sat down in a small room where Eleanor handed Mark a cup of tea. The conversation felt different this time. The usual barriers between them seemed to have lifted, even if just for a moment. "You've been quiet lately," Eleanor remarked as they sat across from each other. "Everything okay?" Mark looked at her, unsure of how to respond. "I guess I'm still adjusting," he said. "It's a lot to take in." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "I know it's been hard. This isn't what either of us expected, but it's what we have now. And I'm trying, Mark." "I am." Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised by her honesty. He had expected her to remain distant, but there was a vulnerability in her words that made him feel like she wasn't as cold and unfeeling as she appeared. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but he couldn't deny the growing curiosity about her. "You're not what I thought you were," Mark said quietly. "I didn't expect any of this." Eleanor's gaze softened, but she quickly masked it with a faint smile. "I've been playing this role for a long time," she replied. "Sometimes, it's hard to remember who I really am underneath it all." There was a long pause between them, and Mark realized that he was beginning to see her in a new light. She wasn't just a powerful woman with a cold exterior. She was someone who had built her empire out of necessity, someone who had learned to shut down her emotions to survive in a world that demanded perfection. And yet, despite all that, there was still a human side to her that Mark couldn't ignore. Later that night, as Mark sat alone in his room, he found himself thinking about their conversation. He had signed up for this marriage, for this arrangement, to escape the financial mess he had inherited from his father. But now, as he thought about Eleanor, he realized that it wasn't just about money anymore. He couldn't ignore the small moments that had begun to change his perspective on her. He hadn't expected to develop feelings for her, feelings that went beyond their arrangement, but there was something in the way she had spoken to him, something that made him believe she was more than just a businesswoman. He wondered if she felt the same way, if she saw him as more than just a pawn in her game. The thought was unsettling, but it was the first time since they had married that Mark felt like he wasn't just going through the motions. The next morning, Eleanor called him into her office. Mark had learned by now that these meetings were often short and to the point. She rarely engaged in personal conversations, preferring to focus on the business side of things. But this time, when Mark walked in, he noticed something different in her demeanor. She wasn't seated behind her desk, and she wasn't holding a meeting agenda. She was standing by the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds outside. "Mark," she said, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking." Mark didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. She turned to face him, her expression serious. "I know this isn't easy for either of us, but I'm trying to make the best of it. I want you to know that I'm not doing this just for the money or the company. I'm doing this because I believe in what we can build together. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I think we need to start being honest with each other." Mark stood there, feeling a mix of emotions. He had always seen Eleanor as a woman of power and control, someone who never let her guard down. But here she was, admitting vulnerability. For the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of the real Eleanor. And for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to their marriage than he had originally thought. Mark didn't respond right away. He didn't know what to say, but as he looked at Eleanor, something inside him shifted. Perhaps he had been wrong to shut down all his emotions, to treat this marriage as nothing more than a contract. Maybe there was more to it after all. The days that followed felt like a strange dance between Mark and Eleanor. They continued to go through the motions of their marriage, attending events, making appearances, and living under the same roof. But now there was a subtle shift in their interactions. They weren't just two strangers playing their parts anymore. There was something more. Mark found himself paying more attention to the little things Eleanor did. The way she held herself, the rare moments when she let down her guard, the small, fleeting glances she would give him when she thought he wasn't looking. It was as if, for the first time, she was starting to trust him. And with that trust came an uncomfortable feeling in his chest, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. Mark didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had started to care. Not just about the arrangement they had made, not just about the money or the survival, but about Eleanor herself. It was a feeling he tried to bury, tried to ignore, because it complicated things. But he couldn't help it. There were moments when he saw her not as a business partner, not as a woman he had been forced to marry, but as someone who was just as trapped by her circumstances as he was. The vulnerability she had shown him, the cracks in her cold exterior, made him question everything he had believed about her and about himself. One evening, after another charity event, Mark found himself walking back to the car with Eleanor. The night had been long, filled with forced smiles and small talk with people he didn't care about. But as they walked in silence, Eleanor's voice broke through the quiet. "You're still quiet," she remarked, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. "What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated, not sure if he should speak the truth. But for some reason, with her, it felt easier to say what was really on his mind. "I don't know," he began, his voice low. "I think I've been avoiding the truth." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe. "What truth?" she asked. Mark took a deep breath, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I think I've been pretending to. Pretending this is just business, pretending that I don't feel something more. I don't know what it is, but it's there." Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment, her eyes studying him. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, and Mark wondered if he had said too much. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I feel it too." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what that meant, what that admission was supposed to change, but it was the first time either of them had said anything that wasn't part of the arrangement. It was the first time they had acknowledged the possibility that their marriage wasn't just a business deal anymore. For the rest of the night, the weight of that conversation lingered between them. Eleanor was quieter than usual, her eyes distant as they sat in the car together. Mark, on the other hand, was lost in his thoughts. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Eleanor had admitted to feeling the same way he did. She wasn't just playing a part anymore. But what did that mean for them? What did it mean for their marriage? Could they turn this into something real, or was it too late? The next morning, Eleanor was not in the mood for small talk. She had an agenda, as always, but there was something different in her manner. She seemed distracted, more introspective than usual. "Mark," she said, her voice firm as she stood by the large windows of her office. "We need to talk about our future. Not just the foundation or the events, but what happens next." Mark stood across the room from her, unsure of where this conversation would lead. "What do you mean?" he asked. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for something. An answer, maybe. "I'm starting to think we've been wasting time. This arrangement, it's not what I want anymore. But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if we can fix it." Mark's breath caught in his throat. For the first time since they had gotten married, Eleanor was being honest with him about what was really going on. "Are you saying you want out?" he asked, his voice tight. Eleanor's gaze softened. "No," she said quickly. "I'm not saying that. But we can't keep pretending this is just about business. It's more than that. I think we both know it." Mark felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. She wasn't ready to give up on their marriage, at least, not yet. But what did that mean for them? Could they really build something together, or were they just too far gone to ever make it work? As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor began to navigate this new dynamic. It wasn't easy, but they started to talk more openly with each other. The walls they had built around themselves slowly began to come down, brick by brick. They shared more about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. And with each passing day, Mark felt the strange weight in his chest lift just a little. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt like there was a chance, just a small one, that they could turn this marriage into something real. Days passed, and Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their delicate balance. They spoke more often now, and the air between them, once thick with tension, had begun to feel lighter. Eleanor, though still a woman of power and control, was letting her guard down little by little, and Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of connection growing between them. He was starting to see her not just as the cold businesswoman who had trapped him in this marriage, but as a woman with her own struggles, her own vulnerabilities. He had always admired her strength, but now he was beginning to admire her resilience, her ability to fight through her own pain. For the first time, he understood that they were more alike than he had ever imagined. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner at the estate. It was a rare moment of peace, and as they sat down at the large dining table, the usual silence between them was replaced by a quiet conversation. "How was your day?" Eleanor asked, her voice calm. Mark smiled, grateful for the shift in their dynamic. "It was good. Busy, as usual. How about you?" Eleanor glanced at him, her expression softening. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, pausing before continuing. "About us. About this marriage." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew this conversation had to come eventually, but hearing her bring it up still made him uneasy. "What about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her glass. "I know it's not perfect. I know this isn't how either of us imagined our lives would turn out. But I think we've been given a chance to make something real of this. Do you think that's possible?" Mark looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of doubt. He could see the vulnerability in her gaze, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. For a moment, he felt like they were standing on the edge of something that could either break them or bring them closer together. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try. I want to see where this could go." Eleanor smiled softly, a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. "I'm glad you feel that way," she said quietly. "Because I want to try too." The air between them shifted again, but this time, it felt like something more than just a moment of connection. It felt like the beginning of something new. The next few weeks were filled with small steps toward building a real relationship. They spent more time together outside of the events and meetings, going for walks in the estate's gardens, having quiet dinners in the private dining room, and even sharing late-night conversations that went deeper than business. With each passing day, Mark found himself growing more comfortable with Eleanor. He started to see beyond the facade she had carefully constructed, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly getting to know her. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She wasn't just the woman who had made a deal with him out of necessity. She was someone who had lived a life full of challenges, someone who had learned to bury her emotions and protect herself from the world. And the more Mark understood her, the more he realized that he, too, had his own walls. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He had built his own defenses, his own barriers, to protect himself from the pain of his past. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the estate, Eleanor spoke again, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "I used to think I didn't need anyone," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I thought I could do it all on my own. But now I realize I was wrong." Mark looked at her, his heart aching with the sincerity in her voice. "We all need someone," he said softly, "even if it's just one person who truly understands us." Eleanor turned to him then, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I never thought that person would be you," she admitted. Mark didn't know how to respond to that, but in that moment, he realized something important. Despite the way they had started, despite the way their marriage had been formed out of necessity, they were starting to become something real. And as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something he had never expected, something that could change both of their lives forever. As the days went on, the connection between them deepened, and Mark began to feel like he was finally stepping out of the shadows of his past. The life he had once known, the struggle, the debt, the desperation, seemed like a distant memory. And in its place was something he had never imagined. The possibility of love, of finding something real with someone who had once seemed so distant. Eleanor, too, seemed to be letting go of the walls she had built. She began to open up about her past, about the struggles she had faced to get to where she was. And Mark listened, truly listened, not just as a husband, but as someone who cared. The cracks in their marriage, the ones that had once seemed like insurmountable obstacles, began to heal. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was something. And for the first time, Mark believed that maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't a mistake after all. As the weeks passed, the tension between Mark and Eleanor began to fade, replaced by something more profound, an understanding, a connection that neither of them had expected. They started to make real progress, not just as business partners, but as a married couple. For the first time since they had met, they were no longer playing a part. They were beginning to build something genuine, even if neither of them knew exactly where it would lead. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Mark found himself sitting in the library of their estate, a glass of wine in hand. The soft glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls, and he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was the first time in a while that he had felt this comfortable in his new life. Eleanor entered the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. She didn't speak immediately, but there was something in her presence that made Mark look up. She stood by the fireplace for a moment, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking, Mark," she said, breaking the silence. "About everything." Mark put down his glass, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What about everything?" he asked, his voice curious. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze focused on the flames. "About us. About how we've been, trying to make this work." She turned to face him, her expression calm but intense. "I think we've both been holding back. I know I have. I've spent so much of my life protecting myself, building walls to keep others out. But you've made me want to let them down." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting this level of vulnerability from her. It was a side of Eleanor that he hadn't seen before, and it took him by surprise. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," he admitted. Eleanor's lips curled into a faint, almost wistful smile. "I never thought I'd say it either. But here we are." The silence between them was comfortable, a stark contrast to the tension they had once shared. Mark looked at her, his eyes softening. "I think I've been holding back too," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on survival, on the contract we made, that I didn't stop to consider what could really happen between us. But now, I'm not so sure it's just about business anymore." Eleanor walked over to him, her movements slow, deliberate. She sat down beside him, her presence filling the space between them. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice low. Mark turned to face her, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm saying that I don't know where this will go, but I want to find out. I want to see what we can be, without the walls, without the contracts." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark saw something in her that he hadn't seen before: hope. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, his hand finding hers. I do. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, holding hands, the warmth of the fire surrounding them. In that moment, it felt like the beginning of something real. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was something. And that was all that mattered. The days that followed were filled with small, but significant changes. Mark and Eleanor began to spend more time together, not just in the business realm, but in their personal lives as well. They went on walks through the estate, visited art galleries, and had long, quiet dinners where they talked about everything, about their dreams, their fears, and their pasts. It was strange, this new dynamic between them, but it felt right. For the first time, Mark realized that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and he was living with someone who was becoming more than just his business partner. She was becoming his partner in every sense of the word. One afternoon, Mark sat at the kitchen table, reviewing some paperwork when Eleanor walked in. She was carrying a small envelope, her eyes bright with excitement. I have something for you, she said, holding it out to him. Mark looked up, surprised. What's this? He asked, taking the envelope from her. Eleanor smiled, her gaze softening. Open it. He did, and inside was a plane ticket, first class, destination, Paris. Mark's eyes widened. Paris? What's this for? Eleanor shrugged, her smile still in place. I thought we could take a trip together. It's been a while since we've done something for ourselves, don't you think? Mark stared at the ticket, his heart swelling with a mix of surprise and gratitude. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to do something so personal. Are you serious? He asked, unable to hide his smile. Eleanor nodded. Why not? Let's see where this goes. Together. And in that moment, Mark realized that they were no longer just living out a contract. They were starting to build something real, something that neither of them had ever imagined. As they stood there, staring at the ticket, the possibilities seemed endless. For the first time, he felt like he was on the verge of something extraordinary. A real future. With Eleanor. And just like that, everything started to change. The days leading up to their trip to Paris were filled with anticipation. Mark and Eleanor had grown closer than ever, and each day felt like a new chapter in their journey. They had come so far from where they started, two strangers bound by a contract, now partners in every sense of the word. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. It was theirs. And as they boarded the plane to Paris, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder about how everything had changed. The man who had once been desperate to escape his past was now flying to one of the most romantic cities in the world, with the woman who had started as nothing more than a business arrangement. Eleanor, too, seemed different. She was no longer the cold, distant woman she had once been. There was a softness to her now, a warmth that he had never imagined possible. They talked on the plane, laughed at the small jokes, and shared the excitement of what the trip meant for both of them. It was the first time they had truly felt like a couple, not just two people thrown together by circumstance. When they arrived in Paris, everything felt like a dream. The city was alive with the hum of people, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the narrow cobblestone streets. Mark felt a sense of awe as they walked through the city, hand in hand. It was as if they were discovering a new version of themselves, a new version of each other. Paris, with its timeless beauty, seemed to mirror the transformation that had happened between them. As they strolled along the Seine, passing by the grand architecture and the street vendors selling souvenirs, Mark looked over at Eleanor. For the first time, he saw her not as the powerful CEO, but as a woman who had opened up, allowed herself to feel, and had, in turn, given him the chance to do the same. She smiled at him, her eyes sparkling in the glow of the streetlights. Can you believe this? She asked, her voice light, full of wonder. It's everything I've ever wanted. Mark looked around, taking in the beauty of the city, the magic of the moment, and realized that she wasn't just talking about Paris. She was talking about their journey, about what they had built together. I think I can, he said, his voice full of emotion. I think I finally can. And for the first time, Mark felt truly at home, not in a place, but with her. The walls that had once separated them, that had made their marriage feel like a business deal, had come down. They had created something real, something worth fighting for. As they stood on the balcony of their hotel that night, looking out over the illuminated city, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come so far from the man who had signed a contract to escape his past. He had come to realize that his future wasn't just about survival. It was about living, about loving, about finding happiness with the person who had once seemed like nothing more than a business arrangement. Eleanor, too, seemed content. The smile she gave him that night was not the cold, calculated smile he had first seen, but something warmer, something genuine. "I never thought I'd be here," Eleanor said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "With you. In Paris." Mark turned to her, his heart swelling. "I didn't either," he said quietly, "but I'm glad we are." They stood there for a long moment, just the two of them, wrapped in the glow of the city and the bond they had created. In that moment, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter full of possibilities, full of hope. And for the first time, they both knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The journey they had started was far from over, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As they kissed under the Parisian sky, Mark realized that this wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning.